Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our TESS seminars. TESS, of course, is our Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science here at JCU, one of our main bodies for promoting terrestrial and aquatic research, not marine research, but the terrestrial side of things. Forests and that type of thing is a big part of our center. I've known our speaker today for a long time, 67 years. He's getting a little long in the tooth, but anyway, he's still hanging in there. It's a real pleasure to talk to you guys today on this talk titled Conserving Tropical Forests in a Rapidly Changing World. I was recently in Brazil. I was asked to give the keynote address for the Brazilian National Academy of Sciences, and the focus of their annual meeting was on the Amazon. So they invited me and they paid my way and all that. Long flights, but it was good. And anyway, this is the talk I gave there. So you'll see there's some emphasis on the Amazon, but in fact, we sort of transcend that in different places. So, well, one of the things that I think we have to realize, of course, is that if we don't know it already, is we're living in a world that's intensely polarized, and there are large agendas afoot in all kinds of different directions. This was that little cartoon there was formerly featured in this group called ALERT, the Alliance of Leading Environmental Researchers and Thinkers, which is an environmental group that I founded. That one actually got me kicked off of Twitter. Used to be called Twitter. And anyway, the bottom line is that we all live at a time, and this is how I looked the morning after the U.S. latest presidential election, and I'm sure some of you felt similarly. And it's interesting to now see the U.S. dealing with a massive brain drain as many academics and others try to get out of the US into someplace a little more friendly. Anyway, the theme of this talk, as I said, is on the Amazon. So I just wanted to say a little bit in general about the Amazon basin and its forests. The Amazon is big. We all know that, of course. It's the largest area of intact tropical forest in the world. There's around 800, if we take our whole wet tropics World Heritage Area, which is almost 1 million hectares, a bit less, and we would be able to fit almost 800 of those into the Amazon. So we really are talking about a massive system that not only has really important features such as its very high biodiversity and ecological specialization and a lot of those things, but also has really important ecosystem services like carbon storage and like its impact on the climate. And the Amazon has a major influence on climate circulations and Hadley cells and all this stuff, which is really important for maintaining not just an ameliorated and favorable environment in the Amazon, but also much further afield in South and South America. Now they think possibly in North America, parts of Europe, Africa. Different areas might be vulnerable to the dramatic physical changes that are happening in the Amazon today. So what's happening in the Amazon basin? Cattle ranching is a massive land use. A lot of it's industrial scale ranching. Soy farming, or which in the States they call soybeans, but anyway, soy, which is a very profitable crop. Most of that's being exported to Asia, particularly China, and to Europe, especially to China. Timber is a big industry, and then there's lots of other things. There's illegal mining, there's lots of legal mining projects, hundreds, thousands of legal and illegal mining projects happening all over the place. There's infrastructure expansion, as we'll talk about, more roads and that type of thing. And there's oil palm beginning to come in a large way in the Amazon. So there's just a lot of different things happening in an area that large, as you can imagine. Roads, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about roads because anybody who knows me knows it's one of my favorite topics, because roads are just so transformative in terms of what's happening in the world, and particularly, in developing countries. And we look around and we see that these are countries that need to develop, they need economic development, but sometimes that development can go awry and there can be a lot of environmental costs associated with that. So the roads are a big part of what we do. Now, one of the reasons that we're so concerned about roads is that according to current projections, we're likely to see something on the order of 25 million kilometers of new paved roads by the middle part of this century on the planet Earth. 25 million kilometers. That's enough to encircle the Earth more than 600 times. So we're living in the most dramatic era of road expansion that's ever occurred anytime in human history. The Romans used to think they were, effective road builders. They have nothing compared to what humanity is doing these days. Now, most of these roads and other kinds of infrastructure, such as hydroelectric dams, power lines, gas lines, various kinds of other infrastructures, most of that development is happening in developing nations. That's probably not terribly surprising, but the numbers I've seen suggest that perhaps 90% or thereabouts of all this development is happening in developing, less developed and moderately developed countries around the world. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure you've all heard about, the Belt and Road, which now encompasses 155 nations and embodies about 7,000 infrastructure projects and extractive industry projects. So it's a tsunami of development. It's really just one national program, but it's bigger than everything else just about. That's one thing that's almost exclusively focused on developing nations. Not entirely, but very, very largely. Now, one of the things that we've realized recently is that if you try to find some kind of a map, let's say you want to work in the Amazon, or you want to work in the Congo Basin, or you want to work in Borneo, and you're going out and looking for a roadmap, because we know that the roads are so important. We know that they're very transformative in terms of what happens to forests. We'll come back and talk about this a little bit more. But one of the things that we realized when we tried to do this in this particular study was published in Nature, one of the top journals, and, oh, excuse me, Current Biology, wrong. No, sorry, that is Nature, excuse me. We found large numbers of roads that just simply didn't appear on any roadmap anywhere. It didn't matter if you looked at government sources or international sources or online sources, you simply didn't find them. And this right here, I'm going to show you, this is a landscape in northern Borneo right here. All three of these pictures here show the same scene. This is the roads that was shown on what's called GRIP, the Global Roads Inventory Project. And you can see over here, OSN OpenStreetMap shows a few more roads than are shown there. This is the roads that we found when we painstakingly mapped all the roads in these landscapes. And we had 205 volunteers who very painstakingly have mapped out these things. We've subsequently gone back with artificial intelligence, tried to map some of these things, and artificial intelligence is getting about 80% of the roads. Our best models, humans are getting a much higher percentage. We know this from various ways that we can test that. So the bottom line is, wow, there's tons and tons of roads in a lot of these developing tropical frontier regions that nobody knows about. The government doesn't know about. There's simply no kind of authority or no kind of environmental assessment or anything typically associated with these roads. It's maybe a little bit of a stretch to call them illegal. Some people call them illicit. Some people call them informal. You can call them whatever you like. The bottom line is they're not supposed to be there. They're not official. They're not sanctioned. They're not controlled in any way. And the government is not aware of them. And because these roads act as avenues for invasion for illegal loggers and land grabbers and illegal hunters and illegal miners, they are just so critically important in terms of determining the pattern and the pace of forest destruction. Now, another thing that's happening is that when you put in a first road into an area, and the governments will sometimes put roads into a landscape, but what typically happens is that road sprouts a whole bunch of secondary roads branching off of the initial road. Those, even if the first road was planned and went through an environmental assessment and had government control, typically there's almost no control for all these proliferating secondary roads. And what's really shocking is just how many of these unchecked, uncontrolled secondary roads there are. You can see here, we looked at 3 major regions in this particular study, and at the Brazilian Amazon, the Congo Basin, and New Guinea, the 3 largest areas of tropical forest in the world. And you can see in orange here, black is the official road. That's an official government road that went in. And all the stuff in red there are roads that have gone in unofficially and basically illegally. Here's another example here. This is in the state of Pará in the eastern Brazilian Amazon. So it's a large state there. And Carlos Souza, very good Brazilian researcher, and his colleagues published this paper where you can see here in black, these are the official roads. If people stuck to the official roads, that would be what was going on. All these areas in red are all these secondary roads. And again, they're illegal, illicit, uncontrolled, whatever word you want to apply. And I have to emphasize one thing about this figure. So one of the things that we wanted to say is, well, how much illegal roads or secondary roads are there? If you put in 1 kilometer of, say, a legal government road, how many kilometers of secondary road are you going to get coming off of that? Well, it turns out it varies. Now, here's the average values, but there's a lot of variation here. But look, in the Congo Basin, you're getting almost 5 kilometers of secondary road for every 1 kilometer of official road that goes in. In New Guinea, it's about 10 kilometers, about 10 to 1. And in the Amazon, it's almost 50 to 1. Okay, so we've been staring at this for a while, and I got to tell you, the Brazilians were shocked and appalled to see some of these data. And you know what you got to realize is this is a logarithmic axis here, folks. So 0.1, 1, 10, 100. So that's logarithmic. If that was just a normal linear axis, what you'd see is the Amazon way up there with lots of really high values. And maybe it's because the Amazon's flat, maybe because it's a prevailing socioeconomic factors. It's not exactly certain, but the bottom line is that there is a lot of these secondary roads. And the forest destruction that's associated with these secondary roads is truly shocking. So in the Congo Basin, you're getting, from all the secondary roads, you're getting about 30 times more forest destruction being associated with those secondary roads than with the primary road, the original road. In New Guinea, about 20 times more, and the Amazon, more than 300 times. You get, 1 kilometer road and you get some associated deforestation with that, but you're going to get 300 times that, 305 times that, because of all those proliferating secondary roads. It is truly an astonishing situation. And I have to say, some of these papers have been getting quite a lot of attention because I think it's kind of, people sort of known about this, but to see the numbers and to see it quantified is a little bit of a different thing. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to sort of take that little bit of an introduction and talk about the Amazon basin and some of the things that are happening there. This is a paper we published in 2001 in Science, and this kind of went viral before viral was really a word. This was on that on the front page of newspapers all over the world. I mean, it was just everywhere. And gigantic controversy and massive controversy in Brazil. All kinds of things happened as a consequence of that. But I think the thing that people were most shocked by, so this is the Brazilian Amazon right here. This is also the Brazilian Amazon. This is a so-called optimistic model. And this is that we generated, and this is a so-called non-optimistic model. So what we basically asked was this. We said, look, the Brazilian government at that time was planning a whole bunch of big roads and dams and other kinds of infrastructure projects. So we said, well, what would happen if all those projects actually proceed as they're currently planned? And government had, at that point, everything was, they had the technical details for everything, like they were really going ahead with this stuff. And what we then ended up was generating these two pictures. But I think the thing that really struck people was not that there was going to be more deforestation in the Amazon. People kind of expected that, but they thought it would be kind of nibbling away at the edges. What they didn't realize is that the Amazon basin was likely to be fragmented on a very large spatial scale by all these massive infrastructure projects, particularly with the roads and highways. And we know that those fragments of forest are far more likely to will be far more vulnerable to predatory logging, to wildfires, to climate change, to those kinds of large-scale changes in the future. So fragmenting the world's largest rainforest on this kind of dramatic spatial scale is something that has people, I think, very rightly concerned. Now, I've been studying forest fragmentation ever since my PhD work, which was here in North Queensland. Subsequently, Susan Laurance and I went to the Amazon for a number of years, lived there and worked there. And this is the kind of thing that you see if you look at real life landscapes in places like the Amazon region. So here's just a couple of landscapes here. This is one called Thailandia, which means Thailand in Brazil, in Portuguese, I have no idea why, and Paragominas. What you can see here in dark is forest, and the areas in areas in light are mostly cattle pastures or other kinds of degraded lands. And the point of this slide is to really show you two things. Most of the forest fragments in these real landscapes are quite small. Small, less than 100 hectares, 250 acres. That's not massive by any means from a conservation point of view. And most of them are also irregularly shaped. And because they tend to be smaller, and because they tend to be irregularly shaped, they tend to be very vulnerable to edge effects and other kinds of external threats that can come from the outside. So that's a theme that we'll come back to in a bit. So can I just ask, how many of you have heard of this study? Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments Project. Just raise your hand for a second. Okay, so just a few people. Okay, yeah. So this is the world's largest and longest running experimental study of habitat fragmentation. It's located in the central Amazon, and we were affiliated with this project for a number of years, still are. But it was initiated in 1979, operated mostly by IMPA. I used to be with the Smithsonian Institution, and the Smithsonian back in the day also contributed substantially. There's pre-fragmentation censuses in this particular study. So, sorry, I should probably back up here a little bit and explain what this landscape is. This total landscape here, it's in the central Amazon. It's about 1,000 square kilometers in area. And inside that area, and these areas that are wide are all forest, primary forest. And then areas here are cattle pastures or secondary regrowth. And you can see here these little habitat fragments ranging from 1 to 100 hectares in area. And then there's also various sizes of sites in the intact forest as control sites or reference sites. So that's the basic idea of this study. And again, it's been running now for over 40 years. So they went in this particular assessment, and Tom Lovejoy led a lot of this work. They did sampling of trees, vines, birds, mammals, primates, small mammals, primates, various kinds of insect groups, amphibians. I mean, you name it, they just sampled all this stuff. And they did it before the site was ever fragmented, okay, because they knew it was going to be experimentally fragmented. So they went in and just studied all this stuff, which is a fantastic resource to have if you're trying to understand how does fragmentation affect an area. Well, knowing what was actually there in the first place is really a big advantage. And also, this is a study, it's an experiment, okay? So we don't have a lot of the other things that would plague Amazonian landscapes or tropical landscapes in many cases, like hunting, like fires, like logging activity, things like that. So basically, it is set up as an experiment. The tree diversity in this area is just stunning. Here, what I've got is the number of species of trees that are bigger than 10 centimeters in diameter, about 4 inches in diameter, that are in a 1 hectare plot. Okay, so a couple football fields in area. And here's comparing 3 different places. These here, Barro Colorado Island in Panama and La Selva in Costa Rica, arguably are the 2 most famous tropical research sites. So they're certainly going to be amongst the most famous ones anywhere. But look at their tree diversity. 60, 70, 80 species per hectare. Then look at what we're getting in the central Amazon in our plots. Almost 300 species per hectare. On the one hand, that's just stunning. You know, that's just marvelous to think that the diversity could be that high. On the other hand, it just about drives you batty because the effort involved in trying to identify all of these things, many of which are very poorly studied, if in many cases not even studied at all. Like it might have a scientific name, or they might know what the genus is and morphospecies 12, you know, but they may not know what pollinates it, where it grows, what its wood densities, but anything about its biology. So that really does render things fairly complicated when you're trying to understand what's happening with say, tree communities, plant communities. So one of the things that people who study habitat fragmentation, like myself, fragmentologists, we sometimes call ourselves, are interested in is like these general questions like these. What is causing one habitat fragment to be different from another habitat fragment in terms of what species are there, what the composition of species there, how many vulnerable species are there, how many extinction-prone species? Why is it that this one has heaps and this one has hardly any? You know, what are these differences? So some of the things that can influence that would be the size of the fragment, obviously. So area effects. The bigger the area, you have larger populations of any particular species. Those larger populations just don't tend to go extinct as quickly as a small fragment with small populations. The isolation and connectivity, so there may be little corridors connecting the fragment, or it might be surrounded by secondary regrowth forest, something like that. Or it may be very hostile. It may be cattle pastures, or maybe soy farms. So the nature of the connectivity of the fragment to the mainland areas of forest is really important. Edge effects that we talked about already, so that these are the biological, ecological, and physical changes that are associated with the abrupt and artificial boundaries of habitat fragments. And then finally, matrix effects, that's really focusing on the nature of the vegetation. Again, that would be the difference between, say, secondary forest and cattle pasture in the surrounding lands. Anyway, that just gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the kinds of questions that we tend to ask. But one of the things I'd like to try to convince you of is that edge effects, at least in this system, at least over the kind of timescales we're talking about, which is the first few decades after forest fragmentation, edge effects, those physical and biological changes associated with the abrupt artificial boundaries of habitat fragments, are very important. So what you can see here, this is a whole bunch of different studies. Each one of these is a different study, many of them conducted by PhD students or master students or whatever. And they've gone out and they've measured forest dynamics or invasive species or microclimatic conditions or insect communities or whatever. And they looked at a whole bunch of different parameters here. And if these are all studied in this landscape, right here would be the forest edge. I mean, these guys are working all over the place, but right here would be the forest edge. And you can see here, this is going into the forest interior, hundreds of meters. The point is, wow, some of those edge effects, they're not just happening in the first few meters of the edge. Some of these things are really penetrating hundreds of meters into the forest interior. So that's an important thing to kind of keep one's head around. Now, one of the most important single edge effects phenomena that we can talk about is increases in tree mortality. Trees are obviously absolutely fundamental in terms of defining the structure, the architecture of the forest and many other attributes of the forest. So if you're starting to get a lot of your trees dying, you may be looking at major ecological changes in the forest. So what this is showing here are some long-term data over a period, I think it's about 25 years. And again, note this is a logarithmic axis, okay? So here we have the forest edge here, and now we're dealing with plots going further and further into the forest interior. So the closest plots are maybe 30 meters from the edge, and then the furthest plots are, I think it's 3,300 meters from the edge, something like that. So bottom line, there's a big increase in tree mortality as we get closer to edges. Why? Why are all the trees suddenly dying? And they don't just die in standing, some do, but some of them get snapped in half and knocked over. Well, we think a couple of things are happening. One is that when you denude the landscape, the lands surrounding the fragments, wind shear forces can build up and accelerate over those denuded bare earth, and then they slam into the forest fragments and then they cause forest damage. So they can snap trees in half or knock them over. Another thing that happens is microclimatic stresses. If you go into a tropical rainforest, a dense tropical rainforest, it's humid, it's dark, there's almost no wind, it's very stable microclimatic conditions, very stable temperatures. You surround that with these hot, dry cattle pastures, and you get a completely different, very dramatic physical change happening near those edges. And so those stresses apparently can cause trees to die. And the reason we think that happens is a lot of trees within the first 2 or 3 months of a new forest edge being created, they just drop their leaves and die standing. There's nothing physically wrong with them. There's no branches breaking off. They just bang, bang, dead. And that is quite a striking thing. So anyway, so this big increase in tree mortality has some knock-on effects that affect the forest in various kinds of ways. One is that it's very obvious that it's changing the architecture of the forest. And we've got data on this. I thought, I'm not going to show you data. I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures. Okay, so here is what a healthy, happy tropical rainforest will typically look like. You'll have open, relatively open understory. You'll have specialized plants growing in the understory that are adapted for the low light conditions, and they'll have all kinds of different physiological specializations for that in life history specializations. But that's sort of what you typically expect. And then contrast that with a damaged forest, with a forest that's been fragmented, it's got some tree fall gaps, it's got that type of thing. Oh, we see a completely different situation. Much more light in the understory, lots of big profusion of light-loving species, sometimes exotic plants, and obvious changes in microclimate and other things as well. So there's a big impact on forest architecture as a consequence of the tree deaths. A second thing that happens is we really get striking shifts in species composition. And unfortunately, this isn't super simple, and it's not something I can easily show you with just a couple slides. So we have to kind of wade into this a little bit, because it's kind of a complicated story. Remember, with 1,300 tree species in our plots, you wouldn't expect it to be simple, right? Oh, sorry, yeah, I showed you 300 was the average. We have 1,300 altogether. 1,300 species of trees. Do we expect to have a simple moral for the story? No, I don't think we would. So one of the things that we really see is a breakdown of the composition of the tree communities. This is something, a Euclidean distance measure, which is simply a measure of the dissimilarity of one sample to another. And so what we've done is we've taken, for each one of these plots in our study, we looked at the tree community that was originally there, and then we looked at the tree community that was there about 25 to 30 years later, and we said, well, how different are they? Well, it turns out if they're an intact forest, they're not very different at all, okay? If you're in the deep forest here, they stay pretty darn similar, Okay, there's storms, there's various kinds of events, but look what happens when we get closer and closer to forest edge. We get these big changes in the overall tree community. Well, so what's happening there? One of the things, and a really big thing that we know is happening, is that pioneer species, of course, which these are early successional things, they got various kinds of adaptations for growing in disturbed and edge affected and other kinds of environments. So we looked at 52 species of our most prevalent pioneers in our study system, and you can see there's a big increase in these things as you get closer and closer to forest edges. So that's one thing that's happening, is you're getting these highly generalistic, adaptable pioneers that are coming in and either crowding out some of the old growth species or simply coming in and taking over where they've died. And then another thing that's happening, so we've lost a number of our old growth tree species, or they tend to disappear, but then we're left with another pool of species. So we have our pioneers, and then we have this pool of old growth species, but it's not the same as the original forest. That's one of the things that we really realize, is that you get winners and losers in rainforest fragments. And the losers, which are the ones we're really worried about, the losers are smaller subcanopy trees, and they tend to have all kinds of adaptations for growing in those kinds of conditions. So they can survive with relatively low light levels. Many of them reproduce, which is the most energetically expensive part of the life history of a tree, typically. And so they can still even produce fruits and flowers and do all that stuff while living in the dark understory, where maybe 1 or 2% of the ambient light, of the photosynthetically active ambient light, is getting down to them. So they're living in tough conditions, and they're specialized and doing really well, and they have many animal associates also. And so it's not just these small subcanopy trees, it's also ones that rely on animal seed dispersers and also have obligate outbreeding systems, which means simply, plants do some strange things reproductively. Some plants, you've got a plant that's both male and female. Some you have a separate male and separate female. Sometimes those plants like that can self-fertilize somehow, but, and there's all kinds of mechanisms for that. But also what you got is that many species have to outbreed, okay? They cannot fertilize themselves. They've got to have pollen or seeds from another, gametes from another tree. So these things are kind of adapted in various ways for these very special environments, and they're kind of designed, you'd almost think of them as being designed for life in the fast lane. Because if you want to always have active sexual reproduction, that means you're going to produce the most variability in your offspring, and they're going to then be perhaps better at surviving in a really demanding place like an Amazon rainforest. Okay, so the species that we've identified there, many of them have declined in the fragments in edge areas. And we also think that there's definite declines of animal pollinators and animal seed dispersers in these fragments too, which other studies have shown. And we think that that's probably important. So really, overall, what this says is there's a lot of these specialized species that are not doing very well in fragments. There's another completely different group of plants, of course, which are the climbing woody vines, the lianas. And the lianas really love fragmentation. They love anything that disturbs the forest, that disturbs the canopy. They like to climb up. They need a trellis to climb up, so they'll climb up a tree or a vine, and in order to get up into the canopy where they can then get light and reproduce and grow up there. That's their life strategy. And they can get big. Some of these things, that guy there is about 6'1" in that image. And you can see there the size of that liana. That's a non-trivial liana. And the lianas are infesting more trees near forest edges. Not hugely different, but enough to be a significant difference. Now, one of the reasons why we get concerned about the lianas is that the lianas appear to be suppressing tree biomass. And now understand that the tree biomass, that live tree biomass, is a very important stock of carbon that is not being emitted into the atmosphere if those forests are intact. But when the lianas proliferate and come in, those trees tend not to do very well. Trees with liana infestations, especially heavy liana infestations, tend to grow more slowly. They tend to reproduce less. They got lower fecundity, and they tend to die more often, okay? So lianas are doing a bunch of things to trees, and none of them are good. And we see here that there's this decline in forest biomass in places that have, in our plots, in places that have lots of lianas here. And also, even though the lianas really proliferated, when we measured the liana biomass, we found that it only accounted for around 1% of the biomass that's being lost because of all the trees dying. So the lianas aren't just replacing the tree biomass, they're just killing the trees or damaging the trees and then not replacing the biomass, which is not good because that leads to carbon emissions, which leads very naturally right into our third main effect of fragmentation. Again, this is mostly associated with these impacts on the large trees, larger trees, greater than about 10 centimeters in diameter. But one of the things that we see is that if we look at our plots as a function of distance from forest edge, we see a major collapse of biomass, of tree biomass near the forest edges. A lot of those trees are dying, and the biomass that they are producing is very substantial in terms of when it gets broken down. So we see that loss of tree biomass. Now, it turns out that the tree biomass, we're not losing the biomass from the forest, which we want to retain so we reduce the carbon emissions. But it turns out it's not just because trees are dying, it's also because a lot of the trees that are dying are big trees, okay? If we look, so they're not just lots of trees dying, it's the bigger trees that tend to be most vulnerable. You can see here, this is the percentage mortality increase for different sizes of trees, 10 to 15 centimeters, 15 to 20, et cetera, on up to 60 centimeters. That's a pretty good size. For a rainforest tree, that's a pretty good sized tree. If you look at their mortality rates of those big trees, something is really knocking them about badly. And this has been corroborated subsequently. Are they more vulnerable to wind shear? Because if you think about the big trees, when they're young, they're kind of flexible. When they get older, they get taller and stiffer, okay? So the crown gets bigger. So, you know, an emergent tree could really probably cop a lot of wind shear. Could it be drought stress? Because they've got to try to get water, you know, unlike the other trees that are trying to pump water up maybe 20 meters or 30 meters from the ground into their canopy, these trees might have to be bringing it up 50 meters or 60 meters if they're a tall emergent tree. So that's difficult. And especially if it's dry, it's very hard for you to get enough water in order to maintain that constant flow of water up to your tissue, to your photosynthetic tissues. And so that's something that you don't want to have. And there's lots of other possibilities too. It could be lianas, it could be lightning. Some people think that they might just be big lightning rods. I don't know. Anyway, there's a number of different thoughts about this. So not only are we losing a lot of trees, and not only are a lot of the trees that we're losing big, so big meaning they store a lot of carbon, but also if we look at the old growth rainforest trees, we see many of them have high wood density in relative terms. So they're dense, they store a lot of carbon because of that. But the species that are coming in and replacing them when the forests get all disturbed would be things like the pioneer trees and the lianas, the woody vines. And they have very low wood density, typically, much lower wood density on average than you would get from the assemblage of old growth trees. And I'm generalizing quite a lot as we're going along here, but this is more or less, it's all pretty valid. So that's another reason we don't get as much carbon storage in terms of what does proliferate in place of the trees that have been killed. Okay, and another thing that's happening, by the way, and there's quite a few things happening with respect to carbon dynamics, but we're just getting a lot more woody debris and also leaf litter. I didn't show the leaf litter slide, but getting a lot more wood debris and leaf litter in the fragments and close to forest edges. Not surprising, we're getting lots of trees that are breaking in half and snapping and falling over, being felled and losing limbs and that type of thing. So that produces a lot of woody debris, what we call CWD, coarse woody debris. And that woody debris can be extremely important. Think about what's happening with our forest fragments here. I want to talk about it, what we might call an important environmental synergism here. Forests are being fragmented, and in places like the Amazon and many other parts of the world, the farmers will light fires in the lands surrounding the fragments. So in Amazonia, they burn the pastures almost every year to produce a flush of green grass for the cattle and to help control weeds. So they just burn almost religiously in these cattle-dominated landscapes. The problem is you've got this forest fragment, which has got all the dry conditions, lots of woody debris, lots of fine flammable debris, just exactly what you want to do to maybe make a nice big bonfire in your backyard. Well, that's the kind of conditions that occur there. And then what happens is these fires, which are burning through the cattle pastures, would normally just hit the edge of the rainforest and die. They do that because if it was an attack forest, it would be relatively humid, it would be dark, And because it's humid and dark, the leaf litter and all that stuff tends to get broken down quickly and not produce a lot of fuel. But you get those dry forest fragments that have got those, tinder box-like conditions, and wow, those fires can just burn and burn and burn. And this is what they look like, even though this doesn't, to an Australian audience, probably seems very unimpressive. You're used to these giant crown fires in places like Canberra and places like that. But these little fires, even though they might be 20 or 30 centimeters tall, they burn through the understory, and they're tremendously destructive, because if they contact any vine, small trees, even medium and larger size trees, those little fires will burn and damage and either instantly kill, or within a year or two will kill a lot of that vegetation. And you can see here, again, this is our plot looking at distance from forest edge. In the interiors, this is a study that Mark Cochran and I did, looking, I think it was about 1,300 rainforest fragments in the Eastern Amazon over a 14-year period. And that's just an average value across that whole area. But you can see here, deep in the forest interior, there's hardly any fires at all. In fact, we think loggers probably actually lit these. But get closer and closer to the edge. Look at that, within 2,000 meters, within 1,000 meters, boy, within a kilometer of the edge, fires are going nuts in these fragmented landscapes. It's intensely destructive. Fire is not a natural part of the dynamic of these systems. And so you see these landscapes and you drive around, and people have sort of quirky words for some of these things. This is a common thing. So there's a little rainforest fragment there. And you can see here, look at all these white, dead, bleached trees. People call that ghost forest, okay? Very common thing that you'll see in Amazonian landscapes, because that's what happens year after year with these recurring fires, penetrating further and further into the interior of the forest. And using our remote sensing imagery, we could actually see forest fragments imploding over time, over just a handful of years. So intensely destructive dynamic. And at the time we published the study we did, I think it was 2007, we estimated there was about 45 million hectares of the Brazilian Amazon that is currently vulnerable to these kinds of fires, which again is about 50 times the size of the World Heritage Area, Wet Tropics World Heritage Area, just to put it in perspective. So we're talking about some big land here. Now, another thing to realize, of course, is that when we're talking about these fragmented landscapes, real world landscapes, not the experimental landscape, like I was talking about in the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments project, that's just studying habitat fragmentation. But Carlos Perez, good colleague, Brazilian colleague, and Fernando Milkowski showed here that they looked at about 150 forest fragments in Mato Grosso state in the Amazon. And this is none logging pressure, none low, medium, high, very high, and same with hunting. And what you can see here, wow, most of the fragments at least have moderate and sometimes high or very high logging and hunting pressure. So it's not just fragmentation, it's not us, things are being isolated with small extinction prone populations, but also the remaining habitat is really getting hammered by these other kinds of forces. The fires, the logging, the hunting, all of this together has a collectively larger impact on biodiversity. Now, just when you thought it couldn't get any more fun, just share a little bit more here. So what we've been talking about right now with this study in the central Amazon is very much a landscape scale study. Okay, 1,000 square kilometer landscape, and that's working in a particular area. There's also work, very interesting work being done in the Amazon, which is looking at the potential for regional scale changes, which might be across the whole Amazon basin, or global scale changes, which of course across the whole planet Earth, to also affect the world's largest tropical rainforest. And so here's an interesting study done by Lapola et al., published recently in Science, a couple of years ago in Science. And what they looked at was a series of what they call, large scale drivers. And this is drought here. So that shows you the frequency of droughts, which there's a lot of concern about droughts increasing in the Amazon just due to climate change. Fire also associated with climate change and also with human ignition sources, logging activity, and edge effects and that type of thing we've been talking about a lot. But you put all that stuff together, and what you come up with is a couple of maps. Now, they developed two maps. One is that they called the good governance model, and one of which they called the business as usual model. And the thing that just struck me about this is, then this is putting all these different threats together and trying to map them out spatially, is that with the good governance model, and I think this goes to the year, I think it was 2040 or 2050, they suggested that we're going to get something like 4 billion tons of atmospheric carbon emissions, okay? About 4 billion tons. You can see there 2.02, 2.09, about 4 billion tons. But under the business as usual model, which is how things are just going now, they're looking more at 30 billion tons. Not 4, 30. This gives you some sense of how much the management, quote unquote, management of Amazon forests can affect the system just so profoundly. Here's another interesting study that looks at what they suggest is going to be climate change, but also with some land use drivers and things. And this is a study done by Bolton et al. And they found that more than 3/4 of the Amazon is losing resilience. Okay, and they have a technical way of measuring resilience with time lag, this, that, the other thing. I've just sort of dumbed this down to something I can understand, which is vegetation depth. Basically, the forests are getting thinner and more sparse, and that's happening especially in areas that are drier, especially in areas that have more droughts, especially in areas that have more human activity, more human land use. So that suggests that there could be large-scale changes happening in the Amazon that are primarily being caused by climatic drivers, along with some land use drivers, and that are having very large effects. And here's another study that was done by one of our fragmentation colleagues there, Phil Stouffer, and one of his students. But in this study here, they asked in these long-term Amazon landscapes that we've studied for a long time, what happens to the bird populations during hot, dry years, during drought years? And they found that out of 29 species that they had good data for, 24 out of those 29 are declining in abundance. So it suggests that the biodiversity per se of the Amazon basin could be very, very susceptible to potentially future changes in climatic conditions and rare events. And that's something obviously to be concerned about. And when to try to bring this back to what our work, because it works mainly on that with trees and lianas in the Amazon, we have found a lot of changes happening in the intact forest. Now remember, our intact forest sites, they're supposed to be the controls, they're the reference sites. They're the sites that we don't really think are supposed to change too much. Okay, they vary a little bit randomly here and there, but overall they should just kind of all be changing a little bit on their own. So we didn't find that at all. We found that when we looked at these things over time spans of 20 to 30 years, we're getting big and concerted shifts in the tree communities right across our study area. I mean, this is extraordinary to me. We've also done work on lianas and forest fragmentation. We find that in the intact forests, the lianas are increasing. They love carbon dioxide, it turns out, and they love forest disturbance. And the forest disturbance is associated with the higher dynamics that we see happening. Forest dynamics are accelerating, and yeah, these are consistent with what are commonly referred to as CO2 drivers. So what can happen when you get higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere is you can actually get a fertilization effect happening, where some species of plants become have substantially increased growth rates and other changes. Won't get too much. We might ask Lucas later to explain all the dynamics of the mechanism of all this stuff, but it basically has to do with the fact that when you've got a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you don't need to, if you're a plant, you don't need to open up your little stomates very long in order to let the CO2 go in. And when you open up those stomates to let in CO2, you also lose water. So it's a really important thing. If you don't have to open up your stomates very long, you can retain your water and save it. And it makes you more better able to grow, more robust to variations in water. So bottom line is, when we look at the fragments and we look at what's actually happening, turns out you probably can't just go in and measure a forest fragment and what's happening around it and say, okay, now we know what's going on. You can't do that, because it turns out that it's a combination, it's a synergism between these local scale changes and changes that seem to be happening at much larger scales, of which we still don't understand. We still don't understand these things very completely. But the key point is that it seems to be an environmental synergism, a sort of an environmental 1-2 punch that is affecting nature. So it's not just habitat fragmentation. It could be climate change. It could be drought. It could be various drivers simultaneously happening. And that turns out to be really bad for nature. We've done an analysis, the study, where we did this for mammals, which I'm showing you here. We also did it for birds and for amphibians. And in all three cases, what we found is this. If you look at the species that have either gone extinct or are really rare, like they're critically endangered or endangered, if you look at those species and you say, what's the odds that those species were affected by one environmental change, or what's the odds that they were affected by two or more environmental changes, the combinations. Turns out you get way, way more species that have gone extinct or that are nearly extinct that are being affected by multiple environmental drivers. It's the synergisms, folks. It's that combination of punches and kicks that are landing all at once that are really what's the fatal impact on forests. So that's a little bit of an attempt to try to pull together some of our work on roads, on forest fragmentation, on species extinction on the Amazon. And this is an area that I think is going to be enormously important to pursue in the future, because the Amazon basin as we know it is being changed really very profoundly, far more than many of us, unfortunately, had worried. So what lessons have we learned from all this? I have a very simple lesson here, and I admit it's entirely simple-minded. And the Brazilians love this, by the way. I said, just keep the damn roads out. You know, it really does come down sometimes to something that simple in these kinds of frontier systems. And this is a guy here, Aeneas Salati. He's a former fellow. He passed away a few years ago, but he's a former fellow of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. And he said the best thing he could do for the Amazon is to blow up all the roads. I quoted him on that many times because I just thought it was such an apt, and he's a Brazilian too. You needed a Brazilian to say that. And of course, we're not really talking about blowing up roads, but we are maybe talking about not building some of these terribly dangerous roads that are going on right now, and which we know are there, and which we know that we really need to be concerned about. Anyway, thank you. Yeah. How do I turn it on? With that? Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I've just spent a short time in the Amazon a couple of years ago, and there was a drought at the time, and there were lots of roads and lots of work. It was around Santarém in Para, and but you could see there was a lot of economic activity going on. There was a huge bulk commodity loader being built there. And I was told there was a road built especially to bring those commodities to Brazil, and the Amazon is the poorest region of Brazil, I was told. How does the political economy in Brazil, okay, there's people there want to blow up the roads, but there's a lot of people who have an interest in keeping those roads going. And I was just thinking how you have a way to resolve those issues. I mean, obviously you're an ecologist, and these are difficult questions that the Brazilians haven't been able to answer themselves. But yeah, I just thought you might have some comments on that and in your long experience working in that country and other countries.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this comes down to engaging with the government, and we really have tried with that in various ways. I gave so many different talks in Brazil, can't even think about how many times I would have spoken there. Spoke before Brazil's National Congress, spoke to the US Embassy in Brasilia, and you know, there's just been a massive effort to try to engage with the public, because the Brazilian public doesn't want to see the Amazon wiped out. You know, like they have a very strong emotional connection with it. But the other issue is that, I mean, if you look, I mean, some of the things you talked about with Santarém, the highway that was built, the BR-163, has turned into an absolute environmental catastrophe. It's almost an abject lesson in how not to do it. You know what I mean? But when they first put it in, they didn't have hardly any protected areas along that. So land grabbers just went in, and there was a line of fire that they said would have been visible from the moon. That's how big it was, like 1,000 kilometers long. And now that's all turning into cattle ranching, and especially a soy frontier. These are big industrial land uses. That you're talking about the storage facility, that would be soy. So I think you absolutely cannot work in a country like Brazil or any other developing country and say we're against economic growth, or you know what I mean? We don't think it's important to have more social equity in terms of livelihoods and that type of thing. But I think that you would also see that there is a large amount of corruption. There's a lot amount of governments. The Brazilian government wants to have better control of their frontier. That's another thing. They just don't, But, we can talk about that sometime. Lucas?
Oh, thanks, Bill. Yeah, that was such a striking slide that had the road density when you actually could account for all the roads compared with the other ones. And I was wondering, do you have to have someone actually on the ground to map those, or can you do it from imagery? And the other thing I was thinking, with now, 8 billion people in the world with a cell phone with a GPS in their pocket, can you harness that to see how people are moving through the landscape?
You can. There's quite a lot of discussion around a lot of that stuff. You can use cell towers, where they try to look at hits. They can even estimate vehicle speeds and things like that. So there are those technologies available in some places. I would have a feeling a lot of those frontier areas probably wouldn't have much. The thing that's been most valuable in Brazil in terms of reducing deforestation has actually been a satellite, the government's DETER program, and they have the programs called DETER and PRODES. And DETER is a satellite system, and then PRODES is a system that's everybody. Unless you want to pay really high land taxes in the Amazon, you have to give the government a map of your land. And they then have this cadastral map, and they have it linked to their satellite in real time or close to real time. And so if a fire pops up in an area that's not supposed to burn, they are now actually, because for a long time, it was like 4% of the people that were actually fined in the Amazon ever actually paid anything or actually had any penalty. So they're actually now starting to go in, and it turns out you only have to arrest a few people or fine a few people, and the word gets around really quick. And yeah, anyway, and then this is when Bolsonaro was, probably Trump was in control there, and things got really bad while he was in there. And he was more or less like, don't worry about any of those laws, don't worry about it, just go. And so they just stopped enforcement. Yeah. Okay. No.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks again for your great talks. There's an article in the Guardian today about Daniel Jansen and his studies in Costa Rica about the insect again there that's occurring in basically protected forest. And he pointed out that the climate change has lengthened the dry season from 4 to 6 months or so, and that's obviously affecting insects. And I was wondering if you, going back 20 or 25 years, when you first started the studies, would you now dial up the alarm about the extreme effects of climate change that would be synergistic and exacerbate the effects of just the physical clearing itself?
Yeah, I would. No, the drought dynamics in the Amazon can be a little complicated. Primarily, there's two completely different kinds of droughts there. There are droughts associated with El Nino events, and they tend to affect certain parts of the basin, the southern, eastern, and north central parts of the basin. And then there's a completely new type of drought, which we didn't even know about 20 years ago, but we do now, which is associated with high Atlantic sea surface temperatures. And that warm air coming off of the Atlantic pushes the intertropical convergence zone, or what do they call it here in Australia? They don't call it there's another name for it. The cyclonic trough, the monsoonal trough. Yeah, monsoonal trough, same thing. Anyway, the intertropical convergence zone tends to push it north. And so when that happens is you actually get a full failure, and you can have a full failure of the wet season and dry season. And this turns out to be not just confined to certain areas, but across the entire expanse of the Amazon, and it's hugely impacting areas in the west and central and other areas that are really wet, hyper wet, and they're not, the species there, the plant species there are not adapted for these droughts, and they're getting hit with these things, and they're getting billions of tons of carbon emissions, committed carbon emissions as a result of that. Millions of trees dying in places where it just doesn't normally happen. So there's enough, I think there's enough interconnections here that people really are starting to get concerned about these interactions of these global or regional scale drivers with the local scale changes, because we know everything's going crazy on a local scale. And then if you start adding all that other stuff into, yeah, it really is a concern. Other questions? Wait for the mic so they can hear you.
You don't want to hear me. I was wondering whether the loss of large trees affects the water balance. But as far as I sort of imagine that large trees pump water up into the atmosphere. Could that be contributing to drought?
It could. Big trees are famous for producing large amounts of evapotranspiration and putting a lot of water up into the canopy. So I would say, look, if you could measure it, I don't know if anybody, do you have any idea? I don't have no idea how you would measure this, except for looking at remote sensing or something. Yeah. But how would you like compare, say, a fragment which didn't have very many large trees with an intact forest area which did have more large trees, but to try to actually measure it, it's not easy to measure the evapotranspiration from these, right? Because you have to measure everything. Yeah. Yeah. Some of this stuff is not easy to measure. You know, it's like, that's why we need to have a canopy crane, JCU.
Bill, could I make a couple of comments?
Of course.
In the early 1970s, when I was studying Nothofagus in central New Guinea, when gardens were abandoned close to the edge of the forest, the effects of drying out became very obvious, and the plants became stressed. But then they were knocked over by Phytophthora cinnamomi. Have you looked at any of the mycorrhiza in the soils to see if there's any Phytophthora or similar pathogens working with these trees to kill them?
That's an interesting question. Ross, I haven't heard of anybody who has. Well, no, I know one lady who's a soil person who does some mycological stuff, but I've not heard of anybody who's asked like whether or not stressed trees would be more disease prone for whatever pathogen. It's funny, I don't know, in a system like the Amazon, it's like some of the threats are just so big and in your face, you know, the bulldozers and the fires and everything. It's like some of the more subtle things, which I imagine are going on too, they just tend to maybe get ignored or not thought about that much. But no, I'm not aware of any work there. No doubt there is something that's been done, but I haven't heard anything about it.
Good, thank you for that. The next point is basically in the monsoonal rainforest of Cape York, because of the whole strategy of Aboriginal cultural burning, it's not uncommon for ground fires to go straight through a patch of monsoonal rainforest and out the other side, just burning at a very low level. And that's not an unexpected event on Cape York. And that reminded me of what's happened when the wet tropics became a World Heritage Area. The Aboriginal burning that was pre-1970 that did occur has reversed the edge effect in rainforests, and some reports that have been up to 20 to 30,000, even some estimates 40,000 hectares of increased rainforests in that time. Any comments?
Well, just in terms of the things that you mentioned, I mean, that's the fact that you're getting some patches of monsoonal forest where you're getting surface fires burning through them. That reminds me a lot of the so-called transitional forests in the Amazon. And you know, those forests, this would be in the areas that would be fringing, say, the savanna areas. Sorry, I was just trying to lost my thought there a little bit on yeah, but and a lot of those plants in those areas that do receive occasional fires will have thicker bark, and they may have, I think they may even have lignotubers and some other things, but it's more, they tend to have life history and ecological adaptations which are more conducive to surviving occasional fires than would, say, deep forest species. So I'm not, especially when you're talking about monsoonal forest, which is going to be completely open in the dry season anyway, I'm not terribly surprised with what you said there, Ross. I would be really concerned if there were areas of intact rainforest that showed that. And that does happen too, occasionally, as you would know. Yeah, that's consistent. What you said is consistent with what I heard and seen in the Amazon.
Well, just following on that, there is a term used in Australian rainforest edges, which is called bastard scrub. And that bastard scrub can be 100 to 200 meters wide, sometimes wider, where the dynamics of the ecotone is such that it's not unusual for fires that have been lit historically over hundreds of years prior to others coming to the shores, entering the rainforest up to 100 to 200 meters, and then other being left and then actually being re-colonized by rainforest trees as they come forward towards where the edge was. Is
Yeah.
that any evidence of that in the Amazon?
Oh, not that I would know off the top of my head, but I certainly never heard the phrase bastard scrub used in Brazil, but I like the word, I like the phrase, it's very evocative. And I mean, I'm sure you would, if you get a fire, let's say you have a real strong drought here, and then you get these fires encroaching into forest edge areas. And then if you didn't have any subsequent fires, the forest, especially if you got a bit of moisture, the forest can, there would be both regeneration of plants, and also probably what you get is a lot of recovery of your pre-existing seedlings and stuff, because when the canopy and other stuff is thinned out, of course, a lot of these things will start growing rapidly. So your advanced regeneration is called, would probably represent some of that as well. Yeah, I would think. Yeah. Thanks, Ross. That's interesting stuff.
Just one more comment, if I may.
Oh, okay.
Has anyone actually reclaimed any cattle land or soy land, fenced it off, and see whether the rainforest edge will actually move into that reclaimed land?
Yeah, that's something that's been pretty well studied. There's large areas of second growth in the Amazon. It's about 50 million hectares altogether. But Philip Fernside has showed that the average age, median age of that, not the average, median age of that regrowth was 5 years. Okay, so what that's telling you is that regrowth doesn't get, typically in the Amazon, regrowth doesn't get a chance to grow very long before it gets reburned. So it doesn't get to capture some conservation potential. But the other thing is that when you look at what comes in, exactly as you said, Ross, if you look at what comes in at, say, an abandoned pasture or that type of thing, it will be a very small subset of your total species, especially if you're any distance at all from the intact forest. So things like Cecropia and Bismea are very common pioneers in post-burn, post-degraded landscapes. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Bill.
Pleasure, Ross. Microphone, sorry. Otherwise, they don't hear you. They don't hear you online.
I can comment on that. The Rainforest Conservation Foundation has the property 88 hectares, which is on the northern side of JCU Observatory and the southern side of Mason's Cafe. 22, did I say acres or hectares? Anyway, hectares. And 22 hectare of that was old denuded cattle. And the ground was that compacted. And the CSIRO checked the ground for us, and the seed bank went down over 1 metre. And so the weeds wouldn't even grow. And so the rainforest wouldn't come in, as Ross was just saying. But once we remediated the soil and we planted only rainforest trees at 1.5 centres, we put 106,000 trees in there at 1.5 metre centres, we had full canopy closure within 18 months, not 3 years, because we remediated the soil and got rid of the seed bank. So that might half answer Ross's question.
Good,
The
thank
only
you.
thing I guess I would say to that is, I mean, more power to you and fantastic, but I'm sure that was an expensive exercise. Very expensive. And that, I think, is one of the big, I mean, if you follow the regrowth, I'm not a regrowth ecologist, but Chasden and other people who are writing on this, they have like suddenly seen the light, and they, after all these years of these very expensive programs where they're going in and replanting and stuff, typically in very strategic areas like along stream corridors and things, but not very big areas, you know, they have now realized that, wow, you know what, if you want to get large scale, at scale, forest reclamation, you need to basically keep the threatening processes out, mainly fire, cattle, that type of thing. And you got to give it time, but you know it will occur. But it's not a fast process at all. I'm sure the species diversity, what you had there, you probably knocked 40 years of succession off of that area. Who knows? Something like that. You know what I mean? By planting, you would have planted a diversity of things. Yeah. Really? Very good. Okay. Well, thanks very much, folks.